1, 2, 3, 4.
One, two, 1, 2. You're listening to the Online Time Fame Podcast. Online Time Fame Podcast. I'm your host, JD. This is a special show because it came full circle for something we were trying to do. We were striving to bring two things together, two people together. We have an author. His name is Michael H. Price out of Fort Worth, Texas. And we wanted him to interview Charleston White, also from Fort Worth, Texas. So we moved around trying to get that together, and we didn't get it quite like we wanted to. We didn't pull it together. So we'll do a review of some points of why the interview is still necessary. Now, people don't know that everyone's familiar with Charleston White saying that one of his major influences was Rudy Ray Moore, the comedian and actor who made the movie Dolemite. And if I'm correct, Charleston White said he was familiar with the movie, as we all were. My Name is Dolemite, the 2019 Netflix film that changed everybody's perception of who Dolemite was, and it chronicled him making the movie Dolemite, and that changed everything. But the point is, the story of Dolemite is not just a movie about a self-made movie of someone creating something. There's a story from back in the 1900s. I'm not sure the exact date. Early 1900s. It's called Ragged Dick, and it was one of the first road to riches tales. Ragged Dick, where it was someone who started out, cleaning up, being a housekeeper or whatever, like picking up and getting any kind of job he can get, and then he became a successful businessman. And that is the premise of the American dream. So the Ragged Dick is from rags to riches. That's the whole where that theory came from. So the point is, whenever you see a movie like Dolemite or one of these types of films, and it's just someone trying to come from nothing and get something, and that's the whole premise of hip-hop music, from nothing to something. And a lot of careers in general, anyone who works somewhere and has the ambition in the right place at the right time, they have an opportunity to do the same. And that's what people come from all over the world to the U.S. to do, is to make it from rags to riches. So this author, Michael H. Price, he's a nationally renowned journalist, historian, author. They work in the preservation of old films, and they work on that in Fort Worth. And this is just my outside observation of the situation, being that I heard Charleston White say that he looked at Dolemite as he made his ascent, his rise in social media. And people think, oh, so you're not going to be around that long. They make comments about Charleston White that he ain't going to make it, not knowing that he had been participating in community activism for years, a decade at least. So there's no Johnny-come-lately surprise flash in the pan story. He was grinding from the street, being sincere. And sometimes people learn later that helping the community isn't always profitable. When you go back to Martin Luther King, when he passed away, he didn't have any economics. He took all of the economics that he generated. He was paid a stipend, a grant, an award amount when he won the Nobel Prize for Peace. He donated that money to, if maybe there was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but the organization of churches, or the nonviolent movement itself, they specific, I'm not sure where he specifically put the funds, but the point is, he donated that. Malcolm X, when he was killed, he didn't have $5 in his pocket. When he was murdered, assassinated, So back then, there were people who they weren't aiming to profit. And even if one just wanted to make a living, that's not always possible in helping the inner city community. So when you hear a lot of people, a lot of entertainers, and they talking about they help and they act like they help, they ain't doing what they could do, because they may not know how to do it and they may not have the intention to do it. But there's two different things. Working in the community and being commercially viable is a whole nother scenario. So the point is, with this author that we mentioned, Michael H. Price, he wrote an article. It was published by Fort Worth Magazine, February 13th, 2025. So I wasn't even aware of it. I was looking at some other way and ended up on this magazine site. And that's when I saw the article they wrote. They had an article, it was called The Fort Worth Rebirth of Dolemite. The second half of Rudy Ray Moore's story would be far less interesting, if not for one memorable performance at a Cowtown club. And that's the title and the subtitle of the article. And as I say, it was ironic because those of us who have heard Charleston White, we heard him talking about Rudy Ray Moore, and he took some of his key points of characterization from Dolemite. Little did he know, when Charleston White was walking around town growing up as a boy in Fort Worth, who's to say he didn't walk right past Rudy Ray Moore? Maybe saw him in the restaurant, in the store, so it wasn't clear. The reason why I want to get Michael Price has been writing for over 50 years. He and another ironic point is this: the movie actor Vincent Price, who made the horror movies, and he starred as Dracula in a lot of films, like long career in Hollywood. He was a friend of Michael Price's. They weren't related that they knew about, but their families were from the same place, from, if I'm correct, from Europe. And the funny part is this, because he knew him from being a journalist. And as I said, people said Michael Price would be sitting in his office and Vincent Price would just pop up when he was in town, because he had family in Texas, and they'd just spend time together, just hanging out, kicking it. And people would be like, oh, shoot, you know Vincent Price? So you'd never know who you run into. And that's the same parallel as Rudy Ray Moore. Michael Price, he also knew Rudy Ray Moore. He knew him, but he said on some newspaper business. And, and the whole story was just unique to hearing and seeing the rise, the media rise of Charleston White, and people would not have known. So there were some key points that I'll touch here, because as I said, and this was 1988 when they met, or when they formally presented Rudy Ray Moore, but we'll get to that. So what happened was, it was the journalist Michael H. Price, he and another filmmaker this is the late Thomas C. Rainone. Rainone family, they have Rainone galleries in Arlington, Texas. His family's into art. And he passed away, if I'm correct, in 2016. He wasn't an older man or nothing like that, so I don't know the cause of him passing. But Thomas C. Rainone, he worked on a lot of Hollywood movies. He did special effects. He was part of the local scene of they have a horror movie scene and a film scene in Fort Worth. And the similar part of it is, when you talk about Texas, you're talking about Austin, South by Southwest Festival. You know what I mean? So that's one day, that's why I said Charleston. I was like, you gotta, I was looking at it myself, and I wanted to let him get to him and be like, hey man, talk to this dude, and who knows what that can do to help develop Fort Worth into something, so children can have something to do. But when you're hot and you're rolling and you're popular and you're a public figure, everybody's trying to get to you. Everybody wants something from you. So you got 90 miles an hour of things you have to say no to or yes to, or it's just too much to do. So we said, we'll just present this ourselves, and at this moment. for the listeners, so they can just know, and then they can go themselves, but and know some of the information. And as since we've sparked this, because I didn't discover this article, I saw the article because someone else posted the article. I saw it online. I didn't see it directly on their website, Fort Worth Magazine. I saw the article that was through another work that was linked there. So, as I said, we reached out to the people, but we said we can do a brief outline of Rudy Ray Moore and part of his interaction with Texas, because he has family in Texas. So, when Thomas Rainone and Michael Price, the journalist, were talking, the writer of the article that I'm talking about, the Fort Worth Rebirth of Dolemite, they decided together. They said, hey, why don't we bring Rudy Ray Moore to Fort Worth? He had been quiet ever since, let's say, maybe 1982. Rudy Ray Moore was also in a movie back then called Penitentiary II. There was Penitentiary I and Penitentiary II, same blaxploitation, low budget level movie. And that was like after his own, probably Rudy Ray Moore's last movie that he did may have been Disco Godfather, but I'll get into that later, because I do have a list of what he, some of his work. But so when Fort Worth, Texas, and Michael Price deservingly get their credit from us, they didn't get their credit whenever people talk about the resurgence of the second part of Rudy Ray Moore's career. And that's why he wrote this article. He pointed out that they don't mention Rudy Ray Moore when they talk about his resurgence in the late 1980s. And when they don't mention him. So he mentioned himself. And this is probably why when I saw the article, I didn't strive to jump right in and do the article and take the credit and say, oh yeah, Charleston White, him and Dolemite are from the same, we're in the same area. Dolemite is known to have frequented Fort Worth. I said, well, let me go to the source and let me reach out to Michael H. Price, and get him to, take some credit and interact with Charleston White himself. So maybe he can, they can work together, because they're Fort Worth people. As I said, I'm on the outside looking in. So I'm just saying it as a contributor, and that's the way journalism is supposed to work. People are supposed to give credit for where they got their information from. Funny story. Let me interject this. A few years ago, during the rise of the internet sensation back in 2020, the internet sensation Kevin Samuels, I may have mentioned this in the previous episode. Kevin Samuels was not the originator of a lot of the information that he spoke about, but he was given the information by a number of scholars and professors, college professors. College professors were known, and they're online and they can be found, but they just may have not preferred to be the face of what Kevin Samuels did. They didn't want to interview a list of women and rank women from 1 to 10. That just the whole format of what Kevin Samuels did wasn't what they were interested in. But a group of scholars knew, we're going to get him the information and we're going to let him take it to that next level. We're going to put him as the face of this. They knew what they were doing. So although Kevin Samuels presented the information, there was 3 key factors that he capitalized upon. They were research, data, and statistics. That was the 3 things he'd say, because a lot of information about so-called black men that has permeated, that has been, that has covered, that has modeled so-called black men, the information that was myths, lies, and rumors and hearsay. A lot of the information wasn't proven about the so-called black male, abandoned fathers, abandoned illegitimate children, the lead of all bad things in terms of family. Though that data was wrong, and we're not going to go into that right now, but the point is, there were people behind what he was doing. They were well more than qualified, and I'm not talking about a college degree they found on some shady website. I'm talking about these are working, active college professors at major universities, and they're the ones. And as I said before, when you go to a scholarship, if it ain't shucking and jiving and laughing and joking, it might not even get views. The views come from the penitentiary talk. If you want to know how to cook a sandwich in jail, that's where the views come from. Gang banging, gang members, all of that is they have a word for it. It starts with the letter N. N stuff. N stuff. That's what gets the attention. So when Charleston White made the transition, and more of the street talk from the academic background, the data, the statistics, the community involvement, the presenting himself in front of the state legislatures and city council meetings, advocating for children, that didn't get the attention, and he tells that story. So that's why I said his story was parallel in some ways to the rise of Rudy Ray Moore. And he didn't, few people knew. He may have known, because I said I don't know him or what he knows. But it was never presented in somewhere where I heard it. That's why sometimes when we say things, when people do these podcasts, they repeat themselves enough where you know their story. And the funny thing about Charleston White is this. If Charleston White doesn't chronicle his whole career in one place in an archive, his channels get deleted all the time. And you don't know, it's difficult for us to even refer his information. We could say, yeah, Charleston White said this in an article on this day, that day, in this year. You go back to see that article ain't even there no more. That post from a social media platform, it ain't even there no more. They deleted his whole content, his whole page. So so the point is, that could have been said and we weren't aware of it. But if we weren't, or if he didn't, and if he did, we're talking about it here, and we put more information up so certain facts can be known. And we'll stick to the fact on this, because what people don't realize is sometimes when Charleston White is doing these shows, one show is the equivalent of 60 shows, where it'll be so dense with information. If one looks up everything that was said, there's a lot of information that gets covered that people overlook. And as I said, it's not just someone who is a flash in the pan, a quick rise and a meteor-like rise to the top. It's more than that, because he had put in the work in the street, working with youth, working with community members, and working with children. And that was his advantage, because a lot of people they used to call it back in the day, when you read and you find they used to use a term called armchair revolutionaries. They in the house somewhere. They may do speeches to collect money. They may talk a good game, but you seldom see them actually doing anything or creating any programs. And that's why the three components that we spoke about in the last episode, we said there's 3 levels of media. And this is just in life. There used to be a saying where they said small minds talk about people, average minds talk about events, and great minds talk about ideas and their implementation plans, their applied format, their applied structure to solve problems. That's what great minds do. So that's why we see more people who, so-called black folk, they like to be entertained. That's why, and when you go back into the tradition of ministers, the greatest ministers were also sometimes musicians. When you went to, if you look at all the famous singers, R&B singers from the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, a lot of church members started coming out of the church tradition and becoming mainstream or popular music artists, secular music artists. So they brought the gospel tradition. Soul music was originally what they called gospel music. Gospel music was called soul music, but the label owners said we can take those same stylings and put more conventional secular lyrics in that and make it into another song, and it might have been a similar same rhythm. That's why you look at C.L. Franklin and his daughter was Aretha Franklin. You look at, you could do a list of singers who are from the church tradition, the gospel tradition, and they became mainstream artists. But going back to, as we continue about Michael H. Price and what he did, as I say, he didn't get the credit that he deserved for bringing Rudy Ray Moore to even wonder. This is a Caucasian man. From what I presume, I haven't met Michael H. Price, but from all indications of what I saw, seems like he's a Caucasian. I say he's the proper way to be, because he's not a public figure. He's older. He's in the low key in the cut, from just in the general sense. And it's as I said, in the modern way of media, that's the best way to be, because now the proliferation of media focuses on people back and forth. A lot of people realize that if I fight and argue, they get more attention than if they present useful information. The gossip, the going back, the threatening, and that's how Charleston White capitalized, because when he addressed the negative aspects of the community that are upheld. It ain't one tape, it ain't one episode. When he's, and when he started talking about the negativity and the glorification of gangs, and he told them dudes they wasn't about nothing, they were triggered and responded, and it became like theater, entertainment, and back and forth banter, and a lot of what was said was true. We have online shows where people will talk about prison, jail, but how many of those same shows talk about college? How many of those shows say, hey man, this is what you do? Because that's why Charleston White said you can count 3 children. Up until around 2014, a study was done and presented to the United Nations talking about how 1 in 3 children would serve time in prison. Black children, so-called black folk, black children would serve time in prison. And when I keep saying that word folk, it's funny because when you go to the Midwest, if you know, just like the West Coast, there's certain key words and letters people can't use. You can't use this letter. You can't use that word. If you say people over here, if you say folk over there, if you say this over here and that over there, and that's a divisive way of thinking because you can't utilize the dictionary. And it's not a negative word. It's a common word used by all. But if you walked into a neighborhood and said this word, these individuals want to kill somebody. And that's why Charleston White rose up, pointed out the hypocrisy and the idiot mindsets that are permeated, spread throughout the inner city like it was cool. So Charleston was telling people, remember, when you look back, and he said, man, y'all need to go to jail, because then you can go and get you some health care, get your teeth fixed. They got dental. You can go ahead and maybe get some educational programs, start reading. A lot of these young people, young brothers, never learned how to read. The parent would throw in a movie and tell the kids, y'all just be quiet and watch that. They didn't read their kids to bed. So when that boy goes to school, ain't nobody helping him read. He go to school, they go around the whole classroom calling each child one by one, and they had to read a paragraph, and this child would be horrified because he ain't never had nobody helping him read and practicing reading. So when he had to get up, if you don't read often, you look at the lines and you can't even line up the one line after the other. You start out on the left side of the page and you're reading that one line, and then your eyes accidentally drift down to the line that's below, or it might drift up to the line that's above. So now you just discombobulated and saying the wrong thing. The whole classroom breaking out, laughing at you. It was almost like they waited, and it was almost traumatic for a child to read out loud in class. Now, a certain amount of embarrassment could be good. It could draw one's attention to learning how to focus. But then that child went home to horrid conditions. He went home to crack, prostitution, neglect, broken household, everything wrong. There could be wrong with a household. We didn't know, but these were conditions that existed. Next, after that, this child is looking at this page, trying to read, and his eyes start watering because he ain't used to focusing on the words that way. It was a terrible experience. So after a while, reading ain't popular. So when you talk about anything dealing with literature, literacy, reading, intellect, all that ain't cool right now. Right now, the most popular people online is talking about gangbanging and being ignorant. These are the people who are projected by major corporations to be the leaders of that race. I ain't gonna name who. It's a long list and too many to name. And these are the people glorified. But then when you go somewhere and you're legitimate, they made it where, meaning street Negroes, you'd be laughed at. Oh man, you sound white. Bro, you sound like you the white man. You reading all clear and literate, and you got your necktie on and suit, because everybody ain't street. When I see, the whole point of this is saying, with Dolemite, it was a story of reinvention. He reinvented himself. He strived to stay legitimate, out of the penitentiary, out of jail. Back in the old day, when one talks to their relatives and family taught you how to stay out of jail. These dudes talk you into jail. See, so but as it's been mentioned by many people, penitentiaries are big business. So these dudes, they see them when they coming. When they come up, you see the boy, oh, he gonna end up in jail because his whole family is jail-minded, conditioned, institutionalized, and prepared for recidivism. Recidivism is those who return from jail and go back to jail. These dudes come out of the system, broken households, and confusion, and the penitentiary system provides more stability than the everyday lives. These people's lives because one would have to break through and see the big picture in order to get out the hole and then be willing to stand on truth. It ain't that. There's a few people striving to thrive, and then there's a few people who are allowed to thrive, and then there's everybody else being thrown under the bus. So you got dudes who get online talking about who told on somebody and who did what and who got punched. But then when they go in the meeting rooms with them Caucasians, that ain't none of how they talked about. And when you go through their resume and say, how many college credits did this dude have? He don't have no academic criteria that keeps him above board on the square, meaning a square, meaning perpendicular, meaning 90 degrees straight up. They ain't straight up, they crooked. So they don't lead by example in a positive way. They lead by bullying and pressure to be negative, to be under their thumb, because they're already being told what to do by it higher up. They don't have no talent. You don't get nowhere without no talent, but their talent is confusion. The confusion that is in the inner city is what Charleston White addressed when he started talking about gang members and people who were in the negativity realm. But that negativity is sensationalism, and it's a lot of people who want to hear what that sounds like. So they're interested. Oh man, what that look like? Who wants to know that? You know what? You watch a prison movie too long and it's like you in jail. I've talked to brothers who came out the penitentiary and they like, man, I ain't watching no jail movie. I was in jail. Why I want to watch that? I'm about trying to stay out here in these streets. So as we said, when you talk about the proliferation, the multiplication of content that's negative, another thing about that, what Charleston White addressed, they got people who could never stand on a street, in a building, at a bar, in a club with a certain group of people. They couldn't even look at you they would come in the club and be petrified, frightened, wouldn't dare talk to you. But you got these hardcore people going on these people's shows who we wouldn't even be in the same room. See, a lot of people come online. That's why this is online time fame, because they're famous from online. You know, they ain't got the fame from the way fame was traditionally in existence, when it was major television networks where one had to be polished and sharp and talented and brilliant and masterful and had, that wasn't. Now everything is mediocrity. You got somebody else writing the rhymes. You got these top producers, and then they pick plants to put them in the forefront. And a lot of these plants who sell ignorance, they sell death by genocide, by selling prostitution. So once you get into by selling drug pushing and all of that, it ain't saying gangsters ain't gangsters. It's the fact that it wasn't promoted that way. It wasn't promoted to the common man. It was kept to the side. It was always kept away. It wasn't something that you saw.
The street is the street, always.
It was completely street, and you didn't get that in your face. See, because as I said, there's a form of bullying. You sit down, you go around certain street people, and they know that you went to college. They know you got credits and credentials, still in the streets, still around, growing up from where people grew up from. But these people knew, hey man, could you talk to my son and show him how to get in school? Of course. This is what you do, my young man or young sister. This is how you do it. You go down to that technical college down the street, that 2-year what they call community college. It used to be called a junior college, and this is what you do. You go into that office of admissions and you ask when they will be giving the next you can just tell them you want to sign up, and they're going to say, can you come back, or are you prepared to take an assessment test? And that assessment test is going to test math, some writing. There's a couple, 2 or 3 components that they're going to test. You take that test, they're going to tell you what courses you are qualified to take. So depending on the degree or the skill or the trade you want, you'll know which courses you have to take, whether your prerequisites will be some strengthening courses to get your math back up to speed. You can know that, and you may be able to even prepare before you go to school. See, you don't hear that kind of conversation, and it's still the same dude. It's still the street cat. These are the brothers that were blacklisted and blocked out because they're going to keep them young people out of the penitentiary. So these are the people who walk around the murderers and killers who get respect because they ain't coming with that rah-rah. The rah-rah is those people that's a fixed situation. It's fixed. So when Charleston White came with the experience to point out who was what and what was where, it lined right up with the message of Dolemite. Self-made, from the bottom, rose to the top. So that's what that was. So that's why we wanted to get Mr. Michael H. Price to be exact, to discuss with Charleston. That's still going to happen whether it's through us or not, but we just want to give you the introduction of what it was. And as I said, Michael H. Price spoke himself. He spoke for himself on why he wasn't included in the rebirth, or the story of the rebirth of the second part of his career of Dolemite, the Fort Worth rebirth of Dolemite. And that's the article from February 13th, 2025. So that's current in Fort Worth Magazine. So it was a good read. And as I mentioned before, Thomas C. Rainone, who knows journalist Michael H. Price, they were just talking and kicking it. And hey, man, what you think old Dolemite is up to? What you think Rudy Ray Moore is? What's going on with him lately? And Michael H. Price is like, I don't know. We need to see what's up with him. So what they did was, they knew Rudy Ray Moore comes in and out of town and had family there. And Michael H. Price knew how to get in touch with him. So that was noble of them to say, even though we haven't heard of him lately and we don't know what he's doing, and he may not be, we know definitely he ain't a public figure no more. Let's talk to him and maybe we can get something going on. So that was 1988. That they brought Rudy Ray Moore back to town. So for a show, and the funny thing is, the place he did the show was a club. It was a known venue called the HOP. The HOP was the House of Pizza in Fort Worth, and they had Rudy come in and they let him know, if you come to town, we'll have some funds, we'll pay you to do a show, and that motivated and boosted him to get back possibly into back the resurgence of his career. And I say possibly because I'm not behind the scenes or part of the inner workings of what happened. But the point is, whenever you hear the chronology of Dolemite's career, the resurgence since 1982 of performing, because he had performed at a comedy performance at a comedy club called Blueberry Hill in Los Angeles in 1982. In that same year, he had been a part of Penitentiary II that I mentioned earlier in 1982. And from there, the next resurgence was September of 1988. That was when he did the Fort Worth, Texas performance, Rudy Ray Moore as Dolemite at the House HOP. So it's called a House of Pizza, but it's also a performance venue, but it's a pizza place. So from there, by however it happened, he got back and started moving around on the road. And what they, it's a deep story, and we have only heard a bit of it. And because of the resurgence of his career through the movie, that's why people started talking about him again, and seeing what was going on. But the point is this: when you go back to October 1990, Rudy Ray Moore was featured in the 1980s rapper, Big Daddy Kane is the late 80s, early 90s. That was the peak of his album recording career. And it was Rudy Ray Moore was featured in Big Daddy Kane's Big Daddy versus Dolemite song on Big Daddy Kane's third album, Taste of Chocolate. And then when you came to June 19th, 1990, Dolemite appeared in a music video for a song from Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em, the third studio album by hip-hop duo Eric B. and Rakim. Eric B. and Rakim had Let the Rhythm Hit 'Em as an album, and Dolemite appeared not on the song, he appeared in the music video, on the intro and the outro of the video. And there's also a stage scene where Rakim was performing in the music video, and Dolemite, Rudy Ray Moore, is on stage with them. And so you're talking September 1990. Because that's when the single specifically, the album was out, but then this video was made and the single was specifically released, and that was September 29th, 1990. So then you come along another way further, another down the road, more experience. You come to December 15th, 1992. That was Dr. Dre's The Chronic. That was the legendary Dr. Dre, the producer from Los Angeles, California. His album featured Rudy Ray Moore's skit called Chestnuts. And that was Chestnuts from Rudy Ray Moore's 1972 album, Dolemite for President. So when you listen to the intro of the song, you hear the song called These Nuts. These Nuts. Again, when we're talking about Charleston White, and you're talking about the rise of Dolemite, and as I said, their parallel path. You see these steps that were skipped in telling the story about how Michael H. Price and his colleague brought that together. So as I said, by the time it was 1994, 93, as time went on, a lot of projects had been made that involved Rudy Ray Moore. He was being included now. You go from 88, and then you come, like I said, up to the time of December 15th, 1992, with The Chronic, the release of The Chronic. Everything changed. Everything started elevating, because The Chronic is a legendary classic album that, that immortalized Rudy Ray Moore from that moment on to, international acclaim. Like, the older the album got, the more classic it became. Soon it was an instant classic, off top. Changed the way people recorded. So more people started working with Rudy Ray Moore. And this was the twilight of his career, and that's how it should have been. But as I said, thankfully, Michael H. Price and the people in Fort Worth recognized Rudy Ray Moore, Dolemite, before anybody else did. And that's what that was. That's what that became. That's what happened. So as we continue, and as we, like when you went to 1995, when it was the next Rudy Ray Moore appearance on a Death Row Records project, and at the time, Death Row Records was the largest, was the most successful record label at the time. They were their gross receipts in sales, they were making 100 million, when 100 million would be today probably 300 or 400 million. To have the same impact, 400 million, 500 million a year in records, in records sold, actual records, not streams. CDs moved nationally, internationally, unheard of totals. So that was, as I said, the Chronic was 1992, but from there, Murder Was the Case, the movie, that was like a mini movie by Death Row, which had a soundtrack. Rudy Ray Moore was there. He was on that. So, just as I said, everything had changed. Everything had increased. The wave of activity created by Fort Worth, Texas's HOP, House of Pizza, just a nice venue, like a collegiate type atmosphere, from what the article by Michael H. Price describes, somewhere where it wasn't a so-called hood or none of that, but it was a lot of middle-class folks, so-called black, middle class, showed up who had remembered when they were, young, who Rudy Ray Moore, Dolemite, and had seen the movies. All of the movies used to be they used to have what they call on video, on demand. People seen it and looked back if they didn't remember, and they were there. And then from that level, Rudy Ray Moore's movie appearances just kept on going. As I said, it was 1994, The Legend of Dolemite, where, that was a documentary which led to the legendary appearance on the Arsenio Hall show. But all of these things that we mentioned from 1988 through the 1990s, from the Eric B. and Rakim, from the Big Daddy Kane, from appearing on Dr. Dre's project, from appearing on Snoop Dogg's project. Then this documentary came out. It was like a film, actually, but it was a film documentary, The Legend of Dolemite, and then that was remade in 2003 and expanded upon. 1994, as I said, that was the Arsenio Hall, when the Arsenio Hall show at the time was the biggest show on television. It was bigger than the Tonight Show. It was bigger than any other late night talk show, because at the time, none of the other shows had hip hop. They wouldn't even consider bringing like a lot of rap artists on their show. So Arsenio Hall had a free run. He could go get all of the hottest acts that are now legendary acts right now. Tribe Called Quest, the Dog Pound, Snoop Dogg, Dr. Dre. I mean, that's all. He could get a Wu-Tang Clan. They just could get all these artists that were legend. They were legends in the making. And anyone who heard the music knew what it was going to be. But this was the hottest late night show. A lot of Caucasians started, really knowing what hip hop was on a national scale because of Arsenio Hall and all that. That's a whole nother conversation. But all of this, again, was sparked by Fort Worth, Texas. Who would have thought? And when that story is told, and it was good that Michael H. Price ain't just saying something to say it. He's one of the most known journalists in the country. 40 plus years, 50 years of experience as a journalist. So and as an author, a wise, a storied author, as one could say. Just writing books, articles, in the movie scene, historian, just a lot. So that's why I said, what we want to see is him talk to Charleston White, because Charleston White's rise was from the ground, from the dirt, from the street level, from the community. See, and we're talking about from the South, and that's what we don't see. So when we hear the story and we see the rise and we see the people who saw Charleston, even with Charleston White, from the beginning you knew something was different because you could see the comedic timing, the jokes and the playfulness. And then see there's a certain protocol that everybody has to use once they become successful. They have to line up and get in line because it's one big show. It's one big show that entertainment represents. And as far as especially because a lot of entertainers, instead of being what they call chitlin circuit, people like Rudy Ray Moore doing all the obscure clubs in the South all through the country in the places that weren't 5-star level venues. They play wherever. They were part of the community. Once people get a certain level of success, they immediately are able to not have any interaction with communities. And that's what most people are. And when something happens and something goes wrong, yeah, they show up right away. Hey, I need y'all help. I need y'all to support me on this. But while they were doing well, they don't come around for various reasons. Some are out of fear and others are out of greed. Some are out of strict instructions. Stay away from them people. And people take that deal. And everybody says, oh, I ain't going to never take that deal. I would never sell out. But people ain't never had a certain amount of cash to be challenged on that premise. They ain't never been there and they never will. And when they put that account in these people's names and they get a chance to see and do things they ain't never done, a lot of people said what they wouldn't do. So, with Charleston White and with these venues that we're speaking about, his film appearances from that 1994, The Legends of Dolemite film, then after that Murder Was the Case film, you had Halle Berry had a film called Baps. That was 1997. Rudy Ray Moore appeared in that. So from 1997, you had another one, Faking the Funk. You had just small stuff, and sometimes it was direct-to-video stuff, Shaolin, Dynamite, Big Money Hustlers, Shoe Shine Boys in 2000, Return to Dolemite, so he went from 2000 all the way to, the time of when he passed, if I'm correct, was like 2008. But he was working. He was still appearing. And yes, many have brought up the fact that he shouldn't have had to work. Some things went wrong. He didn't really have what he had. But as I say, the irony is it took some Caucasians from Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth, Texas. Not the brothers who you hear about and the stars that we supposedly uphold to be such a sturdy people. It wasn't them. It was somebody what from you really know about the dirty South that brought him back. You hear what I said? The South. That's who brought Rudy Ray Moore back into the fold. It wasn't the brothers that they tell the story about. And that's the part that we kind of don't hear sometimes in entertainment. The real tried and true paths and trails that people travel. We don't hear that. We hear what we know about. And it was the South and the people down South who made sure they sparked that second phase of Rudy Ray Moore's career. So the funny thing with Rudy Ray Moore is and you look at it, right? When you look at the big picture of Dolemite Is My Name, the what we see, the album that they showed him taking off with, that wasn't his first album. Rudy Ray Moore had more than one album before he reached a level of success that people started to know about. So he had an album in 1959. So depending on who you ask, some have the release date of Below the Belt. Some have it as 1959. Some have it as 1961. Yeah, the beatnik scene when people were doing this off avant-garde, like modern artistic poetry. The beatnik scene is something like, I think, in the 50s, the early 60s. He made a record from that. And as I said, when you look into his biographer, his official biographer who writes all his, who wrote his book and who knew him for, since like 1991, he was saying how, when he released even the Beatnik album, by the time it hit the street, Beatnik wasn't even in style no more. Then Rudy Ray Moore did another album called A Comedian Is Born. That was 1964. Then Let's Come Together. I'm not sure if that was the one with some singing on there. And Eat Out More Often is the album they show in Eddie Murphy's portrayal of Dolemite of Rudy Ray Moore in Dolemite Is My Name. And that was 1970. And the movie came out in 1975. But even between then and the movie, when they showed that he was putting out records to keep his career going, that was Dolemite for President, 1972. Merry Merry Christmas Baby, 1974. The Cockpit, 1975. Because Rudy Ray Moore had to keep working. As we mentioned already, if you go by the albums, like I said, if you go by the complete list, there's like over 25 albums, comedy albums that Rudy Ray Moore did complete. And then there's some after he passed, and then there's some compilations that were re-released by his estate. But let me see. The movie, if I've listened to an interview about the movie, Dolemite Is My Name, and I had to change some facts around from accuracy, so they did make it look like the first album he made was just an overnight success, although the albums were successful from the very beginning. But the way they showed it at the record store, it was very similar to what was shown. But it was the fact that 1972, 1970, 71, 72 is just as the movie showed in that way. But as I said, the first album was 1961 listed here. It could be 1959, as it appears here below the belt. And then, as I said, from 70s, easily he kept going. 74, 73, he just had them. And he had a formula, and as it says, he had success. And this was back when local record shops were popular, or vital, to the neighborhood. That's how it happened. From word of mouth to neighborhood, from just like, inner city bars and comedy. And because there wasn't really a such thing at a certain point as comedy clubs. They were, the larger clubs in the larger cities. But a lot of places just made way for comedy acts because it was like a hall or some type of venue that had performers, but it didn't necessarily dedicate itself to comedy. So, as we said, Charleston White is just a phenomenon as a public figure, and was successfully able to transition into comedy off online, off the internet, and not just online time fame, not just internet fame, but not just social media, but able to transition into actual in the world activities. And that was the benefit of what he was able to do. But the point of this is to show that the re-emergence, the rebirth of the career of Dolemite is just directly tied to Fort Worth, the Fort Worth rebirth of Dolemite. And that's the article, as we mentioned, by Michael H. Price. And that was February 13th, 2005. That was in the February edition of the Fort Worth magazine. So, as I said, this may not be known, and that's why we reached out to some people. We spoke to some people, and we go, something's going to happen from it, and it doesn't have to be us benefiting from it, just sparking the recognition and the irony of the fact that Charleston White is in character as Charleston White, just as Rudy Ray Moore was in character as Dolemite and was able to rise from the ash, from the bottom, from the street, and make something happen. And that was the benefit. And another part we want to talk about and we want to mention before we go is it was hilarious that, and something people can take note of, because as we said, if we do this talking and podcasting, you have people who like it, who like certain subject matter, but when you go into the people would call it lowbrow, and we don't want to judge it and just say people like what they like. Because, who wants to go to work all day, have all the stresses of life, and then come listen to something serious? Sometimes it's too much, and people just want to be entertained. And entertainment without having to think and without having to deal with the pressures of politics and different events. Now, the funny thing about Charleston White, we'll get into it later. Oh, well, let us finish that point. Rudy Ray Moore was smart enough to know sex sells, sex appeal, flash, the street life, gangsters, and that's not just because of him. When you go back to early Hollywood and you go back to the 1940s and films, night before then, almost silent pictures, you can go back. There were always gangsters, criminality, bank robbery, stuff like that. That was what, the fantasy, the excitement that people, were entertained by. So Rudy Ray Moore was smart enough to put those elements into his movie, because sometimes you can try to make a self-righteous project and it don't sell. It ain't got no sizzle. It ain't got no sex appeal. It ain't got no popular ideas that people want to see. It don't have no sensationalism. And so Charleston White, as he was talking about the community, he didn't do nothing, whereas people gravitated. It should have been the same type of success just from community activism, but that's not how it is in the inner city, because people don't care about themselves. They don't love themselves, and then these people are self-destructive and want to see people topple. They'll build you up to break you down. But the point is, once he had those elements of sex appeal, violence, you need some explosions. And the funny part of the movie, What's My Name, when the producer of the movie was asking Rudy Ray Moore, hey, he was like, I want to have some women and some driving and some explosions and some shooting guns and karate. And it was hilarious when the writer played by from the show Key and Peele, I don't remember his name offhand, and he asked Dolemite about martial arts.
Do you know karate?
No, but I'm a fast learner. I can learn how to chop me a motherfucker. What?
So it was just hilarious that he knew, like, even though he didn't know karate, and that's just a make it as you go attitude, and that's the attitude that built the Wild West. When people went from the east to the west, and they had to improvise. When people went to the gold rush of the 1800s, they had to improvise. They had to do what they had to do. They had, so that's part of what makes the so-called American dream, and that's why a story like that is always popular. The movie, I didn't even realize it. Craig Brewer was the producer of the movie, and if that name sounds familiar, I'm thinking it was somebody else. I'm thinking it was the actor that was in the movie. His name is Craig, and I thought he was an actor, producer, and Craig Brewer is the one who actually produced the movie. He also was the producer of Hustle and Flow. So there's some that rags to riches, that coming up from the bottom type energy that he produced that movie with as well. And as I said, when Eddie Murphy was talking about the martial arts, and people laugh at the fact that it was a self-styled type of martial arts, it was just the fact that it was funny. And some people say it was good to laugh with the movie, at the movie, but the thing is, Rudy Ray Moore and his people were able to laugh all the way to the bank, because with the low budget and the economics they have at the time, he said it was $175,000 of his cash that he took. When you multiply that to back then money, it was upwards of $700,000. Almost $1 million budget. So he took what he had, he bet on himself, and he won. And that's what we see with Charleston White. And as I said, we tie it to Charleston White because he may not have even had an idea what came out of the city of Fort Worth. They didn't even know. It was straight.
What you really know about the dirty side?
It was straight Southern ingenuity. It was Southern, even still in the rebirth of Rudy Ray Moore's career, it was some dudes, some unlikely Caucasian was one of them. That's Thomas Rainone. I'm sure he's a Caucasian. Him, who had worked on many Hollywood films afterwards. This was before he really became a Hollywood special effects creator, and worked on Hollywood movies, and made movies on other, and did other roles there too. They were just talking like, hey man, what you think Rudy Ray Moore is up to? And as I said, it was them who help motivate as far as by bringing him to a gig. And no gigs that we had heard of had been done. He could have did other gigs that we didn't know about up to this time. But the gig that they credited themselves with saying, yeah, we weren't part of, since it was so close in proximity to the time of Rudy Ray Moore's Re-emergence. It was 1988 when he was brought to Fort Worth, Texas. So that could have been remembered. Maybe someone could have said we didn't remember, but it's known now. Someone could come out and say it was 80 another time and another event was another day. But the days that we know and the people who knew in the places that he frequented, meaning Rudy Ray Moore, he frequented those areas regularly. He was always in Texas. So that's the irony. But ain't nothing funnier than the real life belief in himself, the faith he had in himself when he was saying, I'm going to do it in the movie with starring also Wesley Snipes, and Wesley Snipes' character was saying that he didn't even believe that, man, who is this guy? This dude, he's playing a sex symbol or something?
Pretending like he could be a sex machine.
And it was real. It became real. And I mean, just the whole movie of what was happening. It was just hilarious of how how Rudy Ray Moore kept going, never quit.
Pretending like he could be a sex machine. What planet is this cat on?
Rudy Ray Moore, sometimes like others, was individual in his belief, in his faith in himself, that he could keep trying and make it. And that was I guess we see it now as Eddie Murphy made the movie and made the film, and those are the stories of perseverance that are always popular because they are a cornerstone of what happens in America. As I said, people, they put their whole lives in a handful of in a suitcase in a small amount of luggage, and change and shift their whole lives and come to the States. But the irony of that is people who've been in the States for hundreds of years are denied opportunities on their own ingenuity to be successful. Now, this is another strange example that people don't remember. When one goes back and looks at the movie Ray, the Ray Charles movie that may have came out around in the early 2000s. It could have been 2007. Ray, it was starring Jamie Foxx, and Jamie Foxx won an Oscar award for that movie, and it was Ray Charles. There's no way the movie Ray could not get Hollywood backing, but it didn't. There was a European businessman who financed that movie because Hollywood probably would have did the film, but they probably wanted more control over the script. And the people who the writers and whoever owned the rights to the movie, they didn't want to change some things that Hollywood possibly wanted to change, but that was the most backward decision. How wouldn't a movie about Ray Charles be made? But that's another example, and this isn't to say there's hate, there's just ignorance in America about who so-called black folks are, because as I said, most Caucasians you get, they haven't been here longer than American descendants of slavery. The institution of slavery is much older than when a lot of people came to this country and they call other people immigrants themselves, and they're immigrants. And the only, so that's a whole nother topic of discussion, but I'll just say this, because I'll rebuild on this point. When you talk about Charleston White, and when Charleston White gets attacked for what he says because people don't know usage of literature, literary styles, they don't know. When he says, I'm using sarcasm, I'm being sarcastic, sometimes people know the uses, but they just don't know the word to use to do it. And he says this is parody or this is satire, and people don't even realize from high school teaches courses on satire. And when people were in high school, it was Jonathan Swift, a British author who was one of the pioneers of satire. And we're talking like 1800s, like that, like 100 years ago, easy. I don't remember the exact date of Jonathan Swift, but it was at least 1800s, and if anything, late, early 19, but definitely early, before the U.S. And you going back, it could have been earlier than that. But the point is, by Charleston knowing what this was. He was able to circumvent to avoid problems, because problems come when he says certain stuff. But when there's other people saying stuff about so-called black folk, it's nothing. But as soon as something gets said about others, it's a problem. And that's the genius of Charleston White. That's why people say, man, why are you talking about Charleston White, man? You all on his, man. What's up with that? And we're explaining he's the figure, because if you talk about small minds, people, average minds, events, great minds are talking about ideas and solutions, how to solve problems. So you're talking about addressing an issue that can be solved, not to treat people, especially people who have built and gave so much to honor this country. And just as I said, we can go on and on. This is this episode, because there's more we didn't even get to finish, or that could be said. Because as I said, when Charleston White does do a show and you listen, so it can be other people and it can be other information, so we tried to give at least a little documentation and some references that you could get. And if you don't get nothing else from this interview, because we didn't want to go all the way over the top everywhere with it, but we did want to pay homage and respect to Michael H. Price for his brilliant article that he published, or that he wrote in Fort Worth magazine, that was published on February 13, 2025. And that article was titled "The Fort Worth Rebirth of Dolemite." And that just the whole idea of what was done and how it was done. And is a legendary classic film. As I said, it was nothing funnier than just the combination of the martial arts, the jokes, just the comedy, and on another thing, before we get out of here, and this is the last point we'll make. Rudy Ray Moore wasn't the first to curse on records, but back then people used to curse comedians when they spoke a certain way and cursed on records. They'd get thrown in prison. They'd go to jail for indecency. Obscene language was punishable in many townships at the local level, because although people always like to say freedom of speech, every locality didn't have to recognize that, and in order to combat that, one would have to go to the Supreme Court. And cases did go to the Supreme Court around that same time. George Carlin may have been, it wasn't George Carlin, it was Pacifica Radio, which is an independent radio station, and they have locations around the country. That case went to the Supreme Court, and it's called the 7 curse words or something, 7 dirty words. And he said they played his words on the radio, George Carlin, and he went to prison. And that was right around the time when Rudy Ray Moore was really lifting off like no one had ever done, being explicit with the comedy, with the sexual conversation, no more innuendo, straight 1 2 1 2, like cursing. And it was shock value that had never been said. It's always said on the street level outside like that, but they would bring it what was street, all the way 100% a street approach to what had never been heard.
The street is the street, always.
And that's what it was. So, as I said, thank you for listening. This is Online Time Fame. We have some old shows on the podcast page that were from 2022. So we had already been doing this, but we didn't have the way in which we wanted to formulate a new format, a show, a style. We didn't really, we did it, but we never just sat down to do it, and we're forcing ourselves even now because we're always doing so many different things. But it is viable to do this, and as I said, fortunately, we do have an example of something that's being done to be shown, because like I said, we can't even give references and documentation of certain stuff that Charleston White in relation to Dolemite, because his pages get taken down so many times. You can write notes and you can take it, you can record it, whatever you can do, but it's not going to be in one place. So all his shows should have been in one place where it couldn't be removed, and it wouldn't be social media. So, I'm sure they'll get that going at some point, but that's how it has to be. But yes, we appreciate you leaving. Listening, and we are leaving. And I am J Dean, and as I said, J.A. to the you-know-who. And we got it done. We're doing it. And as I said, we just want to put this together despite everything that's going on, so we can bring you another show, some more episodes. And we want to have a frequent schedule where we come back, enough to keep making shows. And if we can get to that level, that would be ideal. So again, thank you for listening. We'll just say thank you, and we appreciate you being here with us today.